you can kind of maintain your buzz or the level of effect you're looking for just by altering how often you puff on that cigarette or how often you pull on that vaporizer. With an edible, and this is one of the big challenges with edibles. There isn't a lot of quality control over their manufacture or how they're packaged, or even for users to understand, exactly how much is a dose. And once you've swallowed that and it's in the stomach and it starts to be absorbed, if you start to have a bad experience or a bad trip, or you're feeling overwhelmed by the effect, you're pretty much stuck with it.
This podcast is not a source of legal advice. No two legal cases are the same. Contact an attorney if you require legal assistance. Welcome to the NJ Criminal Podcast.
Welcome back to New Jersey Criminal Podcast. Continuing in our cannabis series, we have world-renowned forensic toxicologist Dr. Barry Logan, who's here to speak with us on cannabis impairment, particularly while driving. Dr. Logan is a Senior Vice President of Forensic Sciences and Chief Scientist at National Medical Services Labs. There he leads a team of forensic toxicologists and certifying scientists. He's also the Executive Director at the nonprofit Center for Forensic Science Research and Education and is a Fellow of the American Board of Forensic Toxicologists. Dr. Logan has over 150 publications and over 600 presentations in forensic toxicology and analytical chemistry. Dr. Logan, welcome.
Thank you.
I appreciate you taking the time to join us here at NJ Criminal Podcast. Given the somewhat recent legalization of marijuana here in the state of New Jersey, obviously one of the big issues that we are focusing on is how police are going to be able to tell if someone is under the influence and is impaired after having used cannabis in any format and are driving, whether or not they're involved in an accident or not, and also what the public ought to know about how marijuana metabolizes in the system. And so you are the person I reached out to, and I appreciate you taking the time to join us.
Oh, my pleasure.
So just before we get into it, how long have you been studying the effects of marijuana as a recreational drug or even as a medicinal drug in your lifetime, in your studies?
So I've been a forensic toxicologist for over 30 years, and I would say that when I got into the field, the focus really was on alcohol and driving, and there had been a lot of research done over the last 50, 70 years on alcohol and driving, and it was the focus of law enforcement activity because they had tools in terms of field sobriety tests and roadside breath testers or screening testers for verifying their opinion that somebody was under the influence of alcohol as part of their investigation. But it was probably in the 1990s that more attention started to be paid to the role of drugs in driving. And from the earliest days, marijuana has always been one of the most frequently detected drugs in impaired driving populations and in decedents in fatal motor vehicle crashes. So it's been on our radar in the toxicology community for a long time. The landscape, as you indicated, has really changed in the last few years with first medical cannabis and now legalization of recreational cannabis. So we're seeing a lot more of these cases, and we're getting asked a lot more questions about it.
Right, and in New Jersey, police who are trained as drug recognition experts, that testimony by those types of officers has been challenged and is being challenged all the way up to the New Jersey Supreme Court. There's a case, State versus Olenowski, which there was actually just last week a special master report, which is now going to go before the Supreme Court, and we're going to be talking about that particular case in some more detail. And I know at that, there were hearings before the special master, and there was a lot of expert testimony presented. But I want to just ask you, I guess we all can probably say, oh, anybody can tell when someone is high, right? That's the layman's perspective. The question becomes, what are the physiological effects and the cognitive and psychomotor effects, and how does that affect an individual's ability to operate a motor vehicle?
Sure. So there's a number of ways that you can evaluate a person's sobriety or their fitness to drive a motor vehicle in a research environment. You can look at their performance in laboratory-based tests, so things like measuring reaction time, response time, error rate in psychomotor tests. And then there are other ways of studying drugs. You can put people in driving simulators, where you almost like a video game simulation of driving, where you can score their performance. And then there are other studies, particularly those that have been performed in Europe, where they put people in instrumented vehicles with dual controls and send them out to drive on the road. So there's a number of different ways to get information about the effects of the drug on a person's motor skills, either in that kind of isolated environment in the lab or behind the wheel of an actual vehicle. And the data are, and then there's other ways to assess it too. You can look at rates of involvement of drug positivity in motor vehicle crashes and in motor vehicle fatalities. And when we look at the skills necessary for safe driving, so attention, reaction time, information processing, vehicle control, you can identify definite evidence of impairment or decrement in performance in these individual tasks in that kind of research environment, both in just computer tests and in driving simulators. When you, however, go and look at whether there appears to be an increased crash risk in drivers who subsequently test positive for cannabis, that data is not as convincing. It varies from study to study, but there isn't as much evidence of an increase in crash risk involvement for people driving with marijuana or after smoking marijuana with the active drug in their system. So from my perspective and most of the toxicology community, really the determination of impairment is something that needs to be made by somebody who's looking at the subject at the time proximate to their driving and looking for these indicators of impairment. And then a chemical test, typically of a person's blood, or increasingly oral fluid, to determine what drugs they have in their system that might account for that impairment.
Now, why is it that the crash rate is not as high with individuals who have ingested marijuana? Is there a reason for that? I mean, I guess really my question probably ought to start with what happens when someone ingests marijuana or cannabis into their body? How does the body process it?
So when a person is using marijuana, and historically that meant smoking, but of course now there's people who are vaping cannabis and cannabis products and extracts, and there are a whole range of edibles that contain the active component of marijuana. And the effect profile is a little different depending on how you ingest it. If you smoke a marijuana containing product or inhale the vapor, that drug gets to the brain pretty quickly. So you start to experience effects very shortly after you smoke it. In fact, when people smoke marijuana, very often they're what we call titrating their effects. So they will puff on a cigarette or puff on a vaporizer until they get to the level of effect that they are looking for, that's enjoyable to them, that they are seeking when they use the drug. With some of the edibles, the kinetics are a little different. It takes longer for the drug to get into the body, to be absorbed. It's broken down a little differently, and once you've ingested the drug, it's really not coming back out. You're committed to that experience. Whereas if you're smoking, you can just stop puffing on the cigarette. So there can be differences in the effect based on how it's ingested. But in general, people report relaxation, elation. They feel some detachment from their everyday concerns. And the physiological effects include some effects on the eyes, particularly the eye's ability to focus or to converge. And then what's more concerned with respect to impairment is kind of the distracting effect of the experience of being high on the drug and paying more attention to that than you are to a complex task like driving.
Now, in some states, they have given a certain number of, I think it's nanograms in the body, and New Jersey doesn't have that type of cutoff. So, I guess first, does tolerance play a part in the effects of marijuana on an individual's ability to drive? And if it does, then, is that something that should be taken into consideration?
So yes, there is some tolerance to the effects of marijuana, and that in fact is why, in my opinion at least, it's that those per se levels for THC, the active component in marijuana, are not such a good idea, because not everybody is affected the same way with the given concentration of THC in their blood. But what's probably more important with respect to the lack of utility of a per se level is the kinetics of the drug. So if somebody smokes, or somebody, drinks alcohol, on average they can eliminate or metabolize about the equivalent of 1 drink per hour. So over a period of an hour or a couple of hours, a person's blood alcohol concentration doesn't change dramatically, and it changes in a predictable way. When somebody smokes marijuana, the concentration of marijuana in the blood drops precipitously. So within about 15 minutes after the end of smoking, the level of THC in the person's blood has fallen about 60% from what it was at its peak. So over that period of 15 minutes, a drop of about 60%. So when you extend that out, after about 30 minutes, it's fallen to about 20% of the peak. And if you think about in a traffic investigation or a traffic arrest, how long does it take to get that blood sample from the person? It's typically going to be 90 minutes, an hour to 90 minutes or longer, depending on where the arrest takes place and how far they are from somewhere where blood can be drawn. So the level of THC that you're measuring in the person's blood bears no relation to what it was at the time they were actually driving. So that's the reason why that number is really not that helpful in terms of identifying people who are under the influence. And that's why I come back to the importance of having a way of documenting the person's appearance, demeanor, their performance in psychomotor tests as a way to determine whether they were impaired. There's still enough THC left in the blood after a couple of hours to demonstrate that the person was exposed, and that may explain their evident impairment at the time of driving. But these two pieces really are complementary. You can't infer impairment from the concentration in the blood.
I have 2 follow-up questions to that. The first is, most people are familiar with the way alcohol is metabolized, and as you said, about a drink per hour. And most people know what means, a beer, 12 ounces, a glass of wine, 5 ounces, hard alcohol, 1 or 2 ounces, I think. Does it also depend on the type of cannabis product that a person is ingesting? In other words, strength of the THC in that particular product? Is that something that people are going to have to pay attention to, and how it affects their system? That's my first question. And then a follow-up to that would be, with regard to taking a blood draw from an individual, if you have somebody who's a heavy user of marijuana, say a daily user of marijuana. It was always my understanding that marijuana could stay in your system beyond 30 days. So, would a blood draw be helpful in any event? Because if a person's going to show that they have THC in their system, or is there a certain type of blood analysis that can be done that would show the active metabolite of THC in that person's blood?
So in answer to the first part of the question, yes, with any drug, the more of it you take, the more profound the effect is going to be. So if you're a naive user of the drug and you just take a set dose, you're going to experience a lot greater effects than if you're an experienced user. And like I said, you're titrating your dose, so you're taking enough of the drug, whether it's in concentrated form, as in like a dab or an e-liquid, until you get to the kind of effect that you want to achieve, the desirable effect that you're using the drug for. And then because the drug is absorbed very quickly after smoking, and then it drops off very, very quickly after it reaches its peak, you can kind of maintain your buzz or the level of effect you're looking for just by altering how often you puff on that cigarette or how often you pull on that vaporizer. With an edible, and this is one of the big challenges with edibles, there isn't a lot of quality control over their manufacture or how they're packaged, or even for users to understand, how much is a dose. And once you've swallowed that and it's in the stomach and it starts to be absorbed, if you start to have a bad experience or a bad trip, or you're feeling overwhelmed by the effect, you're pretty much stuck with it.
Thank you for listening in. Stay tuned for the next part in this conversation. If you sell by referral, relationship building, and network marketing, pick a time and let's talk about podcasting. You might be surprised. When done correctly, all you have to do is have the conversations. If you're interested in starting a podcast, visit the contact page at njcriminalpodcast.com and send Meg a message. She'd love to discuss your legal podcast.